In February of 2019, I was privileged to attend a national conclave on the SDGs that involved all state governments in India. You had civil servants, you had local politicians, you had several UN representatives, but also many civil society organizations that were represented in this national conversation. And some of the discussions there actually highlighted the achievements that India has achieved in recent years, but also the numerous challenges the country faces in implementing the SDGs. One of the many accomplishments of India has been emphasizing that each of the SDGs requires corresponding budgetary allocations, that there is no point in talking about achieving sustainable development and the 17 SDGs if funds are not earmarked for the implementation of specific focus areas like hunger, like health, like women's rights, like governance, etc. There's also a growing national awareness on sustainable development. And just like in many other parts of the world, for example, in Europe, Indian schools have been talking about sustainable development. There are increasingly newspaper articles that focus on the sustainable development topic. There are regional newspapers in local languages that regularly feature sustainable development. They talk about the SDGs. Some newspapers even have the SDG logo prominently displayed on their front pages. So there is definitely a growing national conversation on sustainable development, which has broadened from this one-sided focus perhaps on just air pollution to encompass the larger set of issues related to sustainable development. One also sees growing awareness among social and economic actors. Even businesses are increasingly talking about the sustainable development goals. But where there is also concern has to do with the availability of data. So at the moment, not all of the 169 targets and the numerous indicators that correspond to the 17 SDGs can be measured. There just isn't data available. So that's one set of issues. And Niti Aayog, the state think tank that coordinates the implementation of the SDGs, has constructed its own index based on available data, which in turn has been criticized. So availability is one issue. The next issue actually has to do with the quality of the data. And India, like many other countries, has faced a challenge in developing, in generating, in sustaining good quality data. Statistical offices, especially at the local levels, are underfunded, and people wonder whether and there have been newspaper reports that have questioned official data that has been published, which subsequently has been found to be not correct. So the quality of data must be viewed in relation to the availability of data. Another major problem has been the tendency to focus on the developmental goals rather than the environmental goals. And India, of course, was implementing numerous very ambitious, very expensive, very large social protection programs before 2015, before the SDGs came into being. But the tendency has been since then to rebrand existing old programs to becoming ones that focus on the SDGs without there being perhaps fundamental differences or changes made to those existing programs. So there has been this criticism that India has simply SDG proofed old projects. There's also been, in a good way, a focus in India on trying to learn from past experience. The long history of implementing ambitious programs related to development and environment has provided numerous lessons. So, in some of the policy discussions I've had with various actors in India, and also in the policy documents that are being published by Indian agencies, there has been this emphasis on continuing with programs that have been shown, and there's evidence that have worked well. In terms of some of the additional criticisms, civil society actors often point to the fact that Indian policymakers have a preference for undertaking technical fixes. So, civil servants, for example, are perhaps, at least in some cases, more obsessed with availability of data and not being able to measure certain things rather than prioritize participation, address problems of powerlessness, address problems of discrimination, etc. So there is this criticism, at least from Indian civil society actors, that one should focus much more on political and social roles and processes rather than simply adopt technical fixes related to measurement of indicators and targets. In terms of the response so far, it turns out that there are areas or states in India that are far more developed in terms of, say, human development indicators than many others. And some of these states are also better able to implement, monitor, and track some of the progress that has been achieved over the years, and then put all of that evidence, all that experience into motion in relation to the SDGs. So you have certain states in India that appear to be doing much better than others. And Kerala in the south is one such state. And you will see in one of the slides later on how certain state governments are doing. But the story here is that the response from various state governments so far has varied. And there are some states in India that are doing really well and some states that are not. Another area where civil society organizations have been critical of the Indian government's response is their argument that the government does not seem to be doing away or ignoring this one-sided focus on economic growth. So while India, they say, the civil society organizations, while India is definitely talking much more about the SDGs, it hasn't abandoned this kind of excessive focus on economic growth, because the Indian government's position is that poverty and unemployment and hunger, all of this can be reduced only if there is sustained economic growth. Civil society organizations feel that is the paradox. One can't have sustainable development if one continues to follow this growth-focused model of development that India has been focusing on for the past decades. But on the positive side, there is definitely a growing interest in the SDGs among private sector actors. And in May 2019, the Oslo SDG Initiative organized a major event in Mumbai, India's financial capital, where we interacted with several major Indian companies. But also, in addition, we spoke to several foreign companies based in India, and all of them were very interested in the SDGs and seem to adopt these to various extents in their company strategies. So major actors like Tata Motors, Mahindra and Mahindra, and also foreign companies are increasingly talking about not just choosing one of the many SDGs, but talking about interrelated approaches, how one could also focus not just on development, but also environmental issues. So that kind of growing interest among private sector actors is definitely a very positive thing. This is the map of India that Niti Aayog, the government think tank, has published. while talking about something they have described as the SDG Index for India. So they have constructed an index based on available data. They don't have data to measure progress on all the SDGs, on all the indicators, and all the targets. But based on available information, they've categorized the states and their work towards achieving the 17 SDGs in the following way. So you have the best states. I mentioned a short while ago Kerala in the south, the front runners, but you also have Tamil Nadu, Tripura, Meghalaya. All of these have been branded, at least in terms of the overarching scheme of things, to be front runners. And then you have the performers here, and at the bottom of the scale are the so-called aspirants. So it's not like they don't use categories like backward or underperforming as much as front runners, performers, and aspirants. And here you see, in terms of the achievement, you have states like Kerala, Himachal Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh doing really well. And at the bottom of the list, you have states that have typically, historically underperformed, have been underdeveloped. States like Bihar, Jharkhand, Meghalaya, etc., and Uttar Pradesh, which is the largest of all states in India. So this is one way in which the Indian government is naming and shaming, is measuring the performance of various states. This kind of a focus, and I should mention that this map actually related to performance on SDG 1, and the Indian government's reports have similar maps for each of the SDGs, whereas this index score relates for, this is a composite score for all the SDGs, and this is where Kerala heads the list of all states in India. So in terms of goal-wise achievements and performances, here is one way in which the government has been publicizing available data on each of the indicators, highlighting which states or union territories are doing well. So on poverty, you have Tamil Nadu doing well. In terms of goal 14, you don't have much data. There's only Karnataka. In terms of energy, you have Sikkim. So you have this kind of, it's not necessarily shaming, but at least giving credit for states that have achieved certain milestones. Towards the end of this short lecture, I want to also highlight something that seems to be very important for India. In some of the conversations I've had, of course, there's this message that is often conveyed in India, that India is a major power. What India does will affect the rest of the world. And one of the many functions of having this kind of explicit, considerable interest in the SDGs, it plays into India's global diplomatic efforts. So this is a picture from a session that I attended in July 2019 at the United Nations during the high-level political forum on the SDGs, where India's ambassador and representatives, the head of Niti Aayog and other civil servants are interacting with the head of the UNDP and other UN officials, highlighting India's performance. And this is particularly important for India as it competes with China and many other countries for soft power, but also global influence on many issues. India likes to convey, at least within its own country, every time UN officials and others praise India, which is of course not unlike many other countries, but this is a typical sort of newspaper news headline where the gist of the story is that UN officials are very impressed with India's performance.